Okay. All right. So let's move on to section 2. You should guys have the notes posted from Google Classroom. So pull those up here. Yeah, we'll do that. Right there. So Tuesday, we were talking about basically the kind of introduction to the legislative branch, right? And on the Constitution test, some of the question for each of the three branches, what kind of like job or their responsibility when it comes to laws, right? And so with the legislative branch, what is their main responsibility when it comes to laws? Make laws, right? Okay, so the legislative branch makes laws. Okay, good, right? Well, among other things, though, when it comes to particular laws, that's the lawmaking body of the federal government, right? And we talked about this. We're talking about the whole Constitutional Convention and the Virginia and New Jersey plans, the Great Compromise, stuff like that. What we established here is a bicameral legislature. What does bicameral mean?
Two houses.
Two houses, right? Those two houses being the House of Representatives, that's the lower house, and then the Senate is the upper house. You guys remember this? Again, some of these questions on this test are kind of just rote memorization. Do you remember how many members are in the House of Representatives?
45.
You're 4. You got the 5 right. There's a number in between those.
435.
435. Okay, there's 435 members of the House of Representatives. Right, and that's based on proportional representation, meaning that the state, right, and again, how do we determine population? Every 10 years, we take a census. This year is the census, right? So, like states like California. California has the most, about 53 representatives. There's some states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, Wyoming. They only have 1 because their populations are small, right? And so it shifts every 10 years or so. So, like I said, they're taking a census here this year. Probably in a couple of years when they kind of do the redistricting and stuff, when we talk about gerrymandering and all that stuff, Illinois is probably going to lose a representative. It's been 1 to 2 since probably not like 1980. We've been losing because populations of people have been shifting kind of to places like California or Florida.
Chicago, what are you doing?
You know, what's that?
Chicago, what are you doing?
Well, Chicago, I mean, everybody says, you know, let's separate from Chicago. If we didn't have Chicago, Illinois, we would be like Iowa, right? And we wouldn't get any federal dollars, as much federal dollars. So I know a lot of people, I have friends who are just like, well, we should sleep from Chicago. It's like, that's not how it works, dude. It's really, it's not. I know, there's a lot of people who are like talking about moving from Illinois because of Chicago. It's more complicated than that. All right, so 435, know that. How many are in the Senate? 100, good. So that's easy. That's 2 times 50, right? So things, and then term limits, or not term limits, but terms for members of the House of Representatives, it's 2 years, remember? So all 435, every 2 years are up for re-election, right? For the Senate, it's 6 years, okay? And so we have about a third of them up for re-election so they don't want to have all of them up for re-election at the same time because chances are you're going to have more of a turnover of 100 than 435. But that rarely happens. Like this past election, the majority of incumbents are going to win. All right. There's like a kind of Congress has a very low, people have a low opinion of Congress, like in the teens. But it's usually everybody kind of reelects their congressman or their senator. It's just kind of how it works. All right. So we're about some things that you're going to see on the Constitution test, which are just basically kind of rote memorization, if you will. All right, so this section here is talking about how kind of like each house or Congress in general is kind of organized, because you have within there these kind of like committees, you have like caucuses and all these other various groups. All right, and so sometimes they give Congress. You'll hear on the news, they'll say like this currently is the kind of 116th Congress in that. All right. The 117th Congress, basically the 117th meeting every 2 years, basically begins on January 3rd. This is established with the 20th Amendment. All right, we were talking about amendments. So Amendment 20 states that Congress starts their new session every 2 years on January 3rd, no matter when that date when it falls on. All right. We'll talk about this again. We'll talk about the executive branch, which has been in the news lately because of Amendment 20, right? The president's the term of office begins on January 20th. Remember, it's only in 2020. So there's been talk about currently, if our current president is going to basically kind of concede the kind of election here, or if he's going to stay till January 20th, like basically being drug out, I guess, of the White House on noon or something like that. All right, so like I said, today we're still in what we call the 116th Congress. That means the session, right? So that's the meetings of Congress. This is the 116th meeting of the U.S. Congress. January 3rd, we start the 117th, and that'll be for 2 years. So every 2 years, the session kind of start over. We have someone both kind of meet together, right? In certain occasions, they'll call it the joint sessions, right? These are for various, but again, not always. A lot of times, these kind of both the House and Senate kind of act somewhat independent of each other, right? In many cases, the House of Representatives is really where kind of a lot of laws start, right? Senate kind of serves as almost like kind of a kind of they basically do a lot of appointments. They serve as some stopgap measure against kind of like the executive branch and that. All right. So within this organization, you have to have certain officers. Right. This is usually just kind of how we kind of things are kind of organized. Right. So in the House of Representatives, what they call the presiding or kind of like the top officer is the Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House is the member of the majority party. All right. And so with whoever has the majority within, and that's why we have an odd number, right? Has a majority in there, whatever political party. We still are kind of a two-party system here, right? And this is something that's not necessarily like the kind of two-party system is not necessarily mentioned in the Constitution. Parties are kind of basically developed soon after the kind of George Washington, right? Do you guys know who the current Speaker of the House is? It's the lady. It's this lady.
I get a name.
I know the face.
Nancy
Pelosi.
Nancy Pelosi, yeah. Nancy Pelosi is from California. She became the Speaker of the House 2 years ago when the midterms when the Democrats, and she's a Democrat, took a majority in the House of Representatives. All right. So this is a powerful position. She's able to kind of determine what kind of bills are get kind of brought in front of the House of Representatives. Usually we'll see we'll talk about the kind of the State of the Union address the president gives. She's usually the Speaker of the House along with the Vice President right behind the president there. All right. The Democrats, although they lost a few seats in this last election, still hold the majority, so she still remains as the Speaker of the House. In the Senate, this gets a little confusing here. In the Senate, the presiding officer, the head officer of the Senate, is also the Vice President of the United States. All right. However, they're not there every day. The only time they're supposed to be there is to vote on breaking a tie. All right. So, the Senate currently right now, there's a few in Georgia. There's a couple of Senate races that are going to runoffs and that. The Senate's pretty close here. All right. I think there was in Alaska there was a Senate race that was decided. I think they gave the Republicans 50 in there, so they I think will still hold the majority. All right. So what ends up happening with the Vice President's not there, the presiding officer, which is more of almost an honorary title for the most part. They don't have a whole lot of influence and power. Is what they call the President Pro Tem. All right, so they serve as the president of the Senate when the Vice President is not there. Vice President is only there to break a tie. The President Pro Tem is usually a person who has been there the longest from the majority party. They're usually really old. All right, and so here's the current President of the Senate, Vice President. You guys know who that dude is? Mike Pence, right? Okay, that may change here depending. And then this is the current President Pro Tem. This is a dude named Chuck Grassley. He's from Iowa. All right. You've had at certain times. There was one guy in the 80s into the early 90s, mid 90s actually, Strom Thurmond, who was 99 when he passed away. He was still in the Senate. All right. He was so old that he used to refer to the microphone as the machine. All right. That's how old that dude was. All right. And that dude was a kind of a staunch segregationist too in the 1950s and 60s. He was initially a Democrat, but when the Democrats started to embrace more civil rights, he switched to a Republican. All right, so usually these guys are kind of the oldest members of the Senate. Probably he's going to keep his title as president pro tem. But really, like in many cases, they kind of like particularly in the Senate, but also a little bit in the House of Representatives, you also have kind of some influential people that are kind of their responsibility is to try to get people, like when it comes to votes on bills and certain things, to try to get the kind of votes there. All right, you have the majority and minority leaders. Majority leaders usually basically the largest from the member of the largest party. All right, so you have a majority leader in the House of Representatives and you have a majority leader in the Senate. More cases, the majority leader in the Senate has a little bit more influence. All right, because within the House of Representatives you have the speaker. The minority leader is from the kind of the party, obviously, that has the less numbers. All right. Let's see. I can't remember who. And then you have these guys right below them called whips. A whip they're really the ones who do more of the they kind of report to the majority minority leaders. They're kind of the ones that do a lot of the rubbing the elbows with the other kind of congressmen and senators and that. Like with a whip, you get this idea, like kind of like cracking a whip. They kind of do more of the footwork for the majority and minority leaders to try to make sure they got enough votes for a bill before it comes about there. Or like for the Senate, a lot of times they do like a lot of things like when it comes to judicial branch like nominations and stuff like that. All right, they determine whether they're going to become members of the federal government. So. All right, so you have majority minority leaders, and then you have a majority whip and a minority whip. All right, and then also you have these they're like more like more informal kind of groups. Like you have what they call caucuses. A lot of times these caucuses are basically kind of a collection of people who have shared ideas or something shared commonality. Like on the Republican side, there's what they call the Tea Party caucus. All right, what they call the Freedom Caucus. These are a number of basically kind of members of the House of Representatives that tend to be guys people that are want lower taxes and less kind of like federal government spending and stuff like that. But then you also have the Black Caucus, which is the main members of the House of Representatives who are African Americans. All right, so they generally kind of like these are informal. All right, these are kind of groups that group together to kind of push through certain legislation. As a voting block, if you will. And you have coalitions as well that kind of serve as that so like within these kind of structures, you have like kind of these informal semi-structures as well. All right. And so like the one like coalition that was on the news, what they call the Squad, which is like very progressive members of the House of Representatives, Ocasio-Cortez. You have a few of them that have about 4 or 5 of them that have like a kind of a progressive agenda. That would be kind of an example of kind of a coalition, if you will. All right, and again, these are informal; they're not necessarily kind of listed in there. And then the more formal kind of meetings here, where particularly each member of the House and the Senate is given a kind of committee role. All right. Because legislation can be somewhat complicated for legislation based on everything from taxation to kind of regulating the internet or air travel and stuff like that. So you have different committees here. So you have a congressional committee which basically handles specific duties on an issue. All right. And then permanent committees. You have these kind of permanent. There's 16 in the Senate and there's 20 in the House here. All right. These are ones that usually with the kind of like the standing committees. These are people that like you want to like in the House of Representatives, you want to get them on the House Ways and Means Committee. That's a very important committee because you determine whether like kind of like where money could go to certain districts in that. Because ultimately for a lot of these, particularly the people who are in the House of Representatives, they want to bring stuff back to their congressional districts. All right, you want to show something that basically you are doing something for the people that voted for you. All right, and a lot of that jobs are done on a kind of like standing committee basis. All right, so you kind of a little video here that kind of talks about the different kind of congressional committees and their.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to get down and dirty, wallowing in the mud that is Congress. Okay, maybe that's a little unfair, but the workings of Congress are kind of arcane, or Byzantine, or maybe let's just say extremely complex and confusing, like me, or Game of Thrones, without the nudity. Some of the nudity, maybe. However, Congress is the most important branch, so it would probably behoove most Americans to know how it works. I'm going to try to explain. Be prepared to be behooved. Both the House of Representatives and the Senate are divided up into committees in order to make them more efficient. The committees you hear about most are the standing committees, which are relatively permanent and handle the day-to-day business of Congress. The House has 19 standing committees, and the Senate 16. Congressmen and senators serve on multiple committees. Each committee has a chairperson or chair, who is the one who usually gets mentioned in the press, which is why you would know the name of the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. Tell us in the comments if you do know. Or tell us if you are on the committee. Or say hi. Congress creates special or select committees to deal with particular issues that are beyond the jurisdiction of standing committees. Some of them are temporary, and some, like the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, are permanent. Some of them have only an advisory function, which means they can't write laws. The Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming has only advisory authority, which tells you pretty much all you need to know about Congress and climate change. There are joint committees made up of members of both houses. Most of them are standing committees, and they don't do a lot, although the Joint Committee on the Library oversees the Library of Congress, without which we would not be able to use a lot of these pictures, like that one, and that one. And, ooh, that one's my favorite. Other committees are conference committees, which are created to reconcile a bill when the House and Senate write different versions of it. But I'll talk about those later when we try to figure out how a bill becomes a law. So why does Congress have so many committees? The main reason is that it's more efficient to write legislation in a smaller group rather than a larger one. Congressional committees also allow Congress to develop expertise on certain topics. So a congressperson from Iowa can get on an agriculture committee because that is an issue he presumably knows something about if he pays attention to his constituents. Or a congressperson from Oklahoma could be on the regulation of wind rolling down the plain committee. Committees allow members of Congress to follow their own interests, so someone passionate about national defense can try to get on the Armed Services Committee. Probably more important, serving on a committee is something that a congressperson can claim credit for and use to build up his or her brand when it comes time for re-election. Congress also has committees for historical reasons. Congress is pretty tradish, which is what you say when you're trying to say traditional. Anyway, it doesn't seem much need to change a system that has worked for the most part since 1825. That doesn't mean that Congress hasn't tried to tweak the system. Let's talk about how committees actually work in the thought bubble. Any member of Congress can propose a bill. This is called proposal power, but it has to go to a committee first. Then to get to the rest of the House or Senate, it has to be reported out of committee. The chair determines the agenda by choosing which issues get considered. In the House, the Speaker refers bills to particular committees, but the committee chair has some discretion over whether or not to act on the bill. This power to control what ideas do or do not become bills is what political scientists call gatekeeping authority, and it's a remarkably important power that we rarely ever think about, largely because when a bill doesn't make it onto the agenda, there's not much to write or talk about. The committee chairs also manage the actual process of writing a bill, which is called markup, and the vote on the bill in the committee itself. If a bill doesn't receive a majority of votes in the committee, it won't be reported out to the full House or Senate. In this case, we say the bill died in committee, and we have a small funeral on the National Mall. Now we just put it in the shredder. Anyway, committee voting is kind of an efficient practice. If a bill can't command a majority in a small committee, it doesn't have much chance in the floor of either house. Committees can kill bills by just not voting on them, but it is possible in the House to force them to vote by filing a discharge petition. This almost never happens. Gatekeeping authority is Congress's most important power, but it also has oversight power, which is an after-the-fact authority to check on how law is being implemented. Committees exercise oversight by assigning staff to scrutinize a particular law or policy and by holding hearings. Holding hearings is an excellent way to take a position on a particular issue. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So those are the basics of how committees work, but I promised you we'd go beyond the basics. So here we go, into the realm of congressional history. Since Congress started using committees, they have made a number of changes, but the ones that have bent the Congress into its current shape occurred under the speakership of Newt Gingrich in 1994. Overall, Gingrich increased the power of the speaker, who was already pretty powerful. The number of subcommittees was reduced, and seniority rules in appointing chairs were changed. Before Gingrich, or BG, the chair of a committee was usually the longest-serving member of the majority party, which for most of the 20th century was the Democrats. AG Congress, or Ano-Gingrichi Congress, holds votes to choose the chairs. The speaker has a lot of influence over who gets chosen on these votes, which happen more regularly because the Republicans also imposed term limits on the committee chairs. Being able to offer chairmanships to loyal party members gives the speaker a lot more influence over the committees themselves. The speaker also increased his or her, this is the first time we can say that, thanks Nancy Pelosi, power to refer bills to committee and act as gatekeeper. Gingrich also made changes to congressional staffing, but before we discuss the changes, let's spend a minute or two looking at congressional staff in general. There are two types of congressional staff: the staff assistants that each congressperson or senator has to help him or her with the actual job of being a legislator, and the staff agencies that work for Congress as a whole. The staff of a congressperson is incredibly important. Some staffers' job is to research and write legislation, while others do casework, like responding to constituents' requests. Some staffers perform personal functions like keeping track of a congressperson's calendar, or most importantly, making coffee. Can we get a staffer in here? As congresspeople spend more and more time raising money, more and more of the actual legislative work is done by staff. In addition to the individual staffers, Congress as a whole has specialized staff agencies that are supposed to be more independent. You may have heard of these agencies, or at least some of them. The Congressional Research Service is supposed to perform unbiased factual research for congresspeople and their staff to help them in the process of writing the actual bills. The Government Accountability Office is a branch of Congress that can investigate the finances and administration of any government administrative office. The Congressional Budget Office assesses the likely costs and impact of legislation. When the CBO looks at the cost of a particular bill, it's called scoring the bill. The congressional reforms after 1994 generally increased the number of individual staff and reduced the staff of the staff agencies. This means that more legislation comes out of the offices of individual congresspeople. The last feature of Congress that I'm going to mention briefly because their actual function and importance is nebulous is the caucus system. These are caucuses in Congress, so don't confuse them with the caucuses that some states use to choose candidates for office, like the ones in Iowa. Caucuses are semi-formal groups of congresspeople organized around particular identities or interests. Semi-formal in this case doesn't mean that they wear suits and ties. It means that they don't have official function in the legislative process. But you know what? Class it up a little. Just try to look nice. The Congressional Black Caucus is made up of the African-American members of the legislature. The Republican Study Group is the conservative caucus that meets to discuss conservative issues and develop legislative strategies. Since 2010, there is also a Tea Party caucus in Congress. There are also caucuses for very specific interests, like the Bike Caucus that focuses on cycling. There should also be a Beard Caucus, shouldn't there? Is there a Beard Caucus, Dan? No? What about an Eagle Punching Caucus? The purpose of these caucuses is for like-minded people to gather and discuss ideas. The caucuses can help members of Congress coordinate their efforts and also provide leadership opportunities for individual congresspeople outside of the more formal structures of committees. There are a lot of terms and details to remember, but here's the big thing to take away. Caucuses, congressional staff, and especially committees all exist to make the process of lawmaking more efficient. In particular, committees and staff allow individual legislators to develop expertise. This is theory, anyway. Yes, it's a theory. Committees also serve a political function of helping congresspeople build an identity for voters that should help them get elected. In some ways, this is just as important as their role in the process of making actual legislation. When Congress doesn't pass many laws, committee membership, or better yet, being a committee chair, is one of the only ways that a congressperson can distinguish him or herself. At least it gives you something more to learn about incumbents when you're making your voting choices. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced at...
So there's a lot of committees here, basically. So the job of kind of lawmaking, we'll get into how a bill becomes a law next week, but this requires a lot of not just kind of grouping by committees, but also staffers and stuff. So you have also like joint committees. These are basically kind of you have a joint committee a lot of times to work out the differences with a bill and that, and then select committees. A lot of times select committees are done like things on investigations. Like there was a select committee on some years ago on the 9/11 Commission. And it was like kind of they had like a select committee on that. Select committee on the Benghazi issue. There was a select committee that was dealing with the kind of Russian interference in the 2016 election. The select committees a lot of times after something has been investigated and such, they'll usually kind of disband, right? But a lot of this is determined by officers. How long they've been in Congress and such, right? Then you have subcommittees, right? Basically, kind of these are like you'll have a subcommittee for each of the major committees there, to basically kind of get the idea to kind of be brought in front of a full committee, kind of work out certain because laws. A lot of these laws, and a lot of these that kind of in the House of Representatives, these are the ones that tend to do most of the lawmaking, right? In the Senate, a lot of times these subcommittees are used for kind of gatekeeping, if you will. And then you have conference committees. These are joint committees that kind of serve kind of similar function. All right. And again, you have a whole bunch of these different committees that are all specific for certain aspects of kind of like commerce, certain aspects of anything that can be regulated by Congress. All right. So on Tuesday, we'll talk about how a bill becomes a law and how some of these committees can play a role in that and such.
Do you know what our work is for tomorrow?
Yeah, I'm just sending out one of the, actually it's gonna be two worksheets, one on the House of Representatives, one on the Senate. I think it for one grade. It's the same type of assignment. Mhm.